pod bay doors, please, Hal.
It isn't enough to tell us what a man did. You've got to tell us who he was.
If I hadn't been very rich, I might have been a really great man.
I'm Charles Foster Kane!
The pod bay doors are open. Thank you for joining us once again. I'm your host, Doug Heller, film critic and film historian for TalkMovieToMe.com. Here, as always, with my co-host, Jerry Dean Roberts, film critic for ArmchairCinema.com, ArmchairOscars.com, and OverThinkingOscars.wordpress.com. Jerry, what's up?
A toast, Doug, to love on my terms. Those are the only terms anybody ever knows. I own. Welcome to our 100th episode.
100th episode. Me and Mr. Roberts, who's too old to be called anything else.
Yes. We have been doing this, I think we started this on September 24th, 2017. A little less than 2 years. And now we're here at the 100th episode, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Yeah, it's been a whole lot of fun, and now we get to do the big one.
We saved this for our 100th episode.
We've done 2001: A Space Odyssey. We've done Star Wars and all sorts of things, and now
Citizen Kane,
the granddaddy. Citizen Kane.
I'm going to tell you, I love Citizen Kane.
I do too.
I do. I really do. I don't watch it very often, because I need to be in the mood for it. And it's an unusual film. I can't compare it to anything else.
No, it really does stand by itself, even after all of these years. And it's almost 80 years old.
I was thinking about this last night, is that I think about the films that are made around the time. This came out in 1941. And I think about, this does not feel like a movie that came from 1941.
No, largely, every Orson Welles movie is at least 20 years early.
Right.
So this is the kind of movie that you might expect to see from 1961.
I can't place this in any particular time. Because honestly, I think about a movie that was made the year earlier, The Grapes of Wrath.
Mm-hmm.
That feels like a movie made in the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
Movie
So does
made after
The
this.
Maltese Falcon, that just came out a few months after this.
And Casablanca,
Mm-hmm.
which were made after this, around this time. Those feel like movies that were made in the 40s. This does not feel like an old movie.
No. It's
such an enigma.
This is one of the most vibrant and alive pictures, with good reason, frequently cited as the greatest movie ever made, because I think,
Which is,
for a lot of that reason, because it doesn't feel like it was shot in 1941.
that term, though, the greatest movie ever made, that scares people to death.
It does, because they're thinking that it's going to be some pretentious. This is a damn entertaining movie.
It is a hell of an entertaining movie. But people back off when you say the greatest movie ever made, because like, okay, well,
right. It
we'll
seems
see.
it seems too high-minded,
Yeah.
and then when people go into the big problem, the big issue that I have with Citizen Kane now is that it was so influential that people don't understand that it was influential. Like they don't see how great it is because so many people have used it as a jumping off point.
And so of its time, momentarily, and I mean, I know I said that it doesn't feel like a movie made, but it has elements that would have been familiar at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And again, strangely enough, the trick is it still feels timeless.
Mm-hmm. It's it plays with time in ways that make it feel like it's outside of time because of the way that it's manipulated, and the flashback was not an original concept by Wells. Nothing he does here. This is the fabulous
90%
part.
of this movie is flashback.
Right. Most of what he does are not new techniques.
Mm-hmm.
They're just employed in an incredibly new way. It's very innovative. Yeah. The structure, flashback structure, would eventually become what noir is known for.
Right.
But at the time, flashbacks were not used that much outside of a framing device. It would be something like Yankee Doodle Dandy, where the beginning and the end would be set in the then present, and then it would flash back, but the whole movie would be just this big flashback, and it would end up...
Yeah, you would have a flashback sequence like Fred McMurray sitting in the office with a bullet in him,
mm-hmm.
and he's got this little thing, and he's dictating.
But even that was 4 years later.
Yeah, he's got this thing, he's dictating the story before he dies. Mm-hmm. And then you go into the movie, and then you come back to that at the end. And, you know, and filmmakers would learn how to play with this. One of my favorites was Billy Wilder learned how to play with this by having in Sunset Boulevard a flashback structure. The narrative is told
by a dead man.
By a guy who's dead.
And you find it out right at the beginning.
Right.
Right. Which is a movie that we are going to talk about.
Oh, absolutely.
Potentially even this year.
I have a question for you, though.
Yeah.
And this is probably the most important question when it comes to Kane. What is this movie about?
A man.
It's about a man. You can say, and whenever you come up with any suggestion of an answer to that question, what you will inevitably come up with is just the TV guide version of this plot. When you start thinking about it, it is about so much more
right.
than anything you can describe.
To me, if you're going to boil it down to a plot, which is so much more than a plot.
It is.
But if you're just going to go on a plot, I would say it is the life of a famous man remembered by those closest to him.
Right.
Posthumously being remembered. And even that fails to encapsulate so much of what this ends up being about.
It's so complex. Even when you think you know what it's about, you realize there's so much more to it than that.
Mm-hmm.
There are 9 or 10 different points of view.
Which is unheard of even now.
Right.
And if you notice, his style changes a little bit with each narrator.
Yeah.
He attempts to adopt their storytelling method with each little clip. They definitely go from that person's perspective and little touches, and there's each sequence is a little bit different depending on who's telling that story.
There are 7 layers to this film. The narrative of this film is very circular.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little like, if you've ever been to Walmart, you see that silly little thing where you put the quarter in and the quarter rolls around and around and around and spiral and then falls down finally in a hole in the bottom. In a lot of ways, that's representative of what this movie is like. The further down you go, the further down you go, as they uncover these mysteries about who Kane was, something is revealed. But it goes in a circle, down and down and down and down until you get to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
But the strange thing about this is that in those 7 layers, as the movie peels each one of them back, it's a box with question marks on it. And
Right.
when you open the box with question marks in it, you will find a box with more question marks on it.
Yep.
Until you get to the center of the film, and when you get to the very center of the film, when you finally get to the heart of all of it, you open it up and you find that the final box is a box full of question marks.
Right. And I think what I love about this is the great story, the impetus for all of these stories being told is the reporter trying to find out the meaning of Rosebud, the last words of a man who was famous, rich, reclusive, and it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
But it means everything. Like, people will tell you, oh, it's the sled. Okay. But what does that mean? Does he lament his lost childhood? Does he lament that he was not, in effect, raised by his parents? Does he lament that he grew up with money and that he developed all of these trappings based on his position in society, holding the 6th largest private fortune in the world?
Right.
Like, what does the sled represent? The sled represents whatever you want it to represent. Missed opportunities, lost childhood, and inability to grow up past a certain point, which he always seemed a little childlike throughout the whole film.
Nobody can ever really know, because you can't ever really know a person. You can spend
Exactly.
your whole life with somebody and never really know that person.
That's
you're not
really the beauty of this. Yeah, you
What?
spend so much time with all the people that knew him, and you get a sense of him, but you know that there's still so much more.
The visual tapestry of this film is brilliant too. It opens. The very first thing we see in this film, after the RK logo, is that sign, that rusty sign that says no trespassing.
Which
the movie
immediately
ends
we do.
Yeah, the movie ends that way too.
Yeah.
The movie ends on that image. And this is the only time we will actually see him. This is the only time we'll see him by himself.
Mm-hmm.
In the present, is on his deathbed.
But he's not alone.
He utters the most famous word in the history of the cinema, and the most mysterious, Rosebud. And then he drops, and we don't find this out till later. Actually, if you're not paying attention, you probably don't know that that's Susan's snow globe.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the great tricks is they never point this out, but later on you just have to notice the fact that when he first meets Susan and goes to her apartment, that snow globe is sitting on her dresser.
Right.
So it's like an indication he was still in love with her all the way up to the moment of his death. And the layers. Like I say, there are 7 layers to this film. There's the news on the march, which tells us the nuts and bolts. It tells us what we need to know. It tells us who Kane was as a public person, what anybody on the street might have known. The second layer is Thatcher's diaries, Thatcher's memoirs. The third layer is Bernstein. The fourth layer is Jedediah. The fifth layer is Susan. The sixth is the butler. And the seventh is Mr. Thompson. And what he finally came to find out. He's the newspaper man who's coming to.
Played by later disaster film producer Irwin Allen.
No, that was not Irwin Allen. This is William Allen.
William Allen, that's right.
Who was part of the...
but he became a producer, director of...
And he was part of the Mercury Theater.
Right.
But as you get down deeper into this, again, the narrative structure is very circular. So as you go down and down, you reveal a little bit more. A little bit more and a little bit more. What's interesting to me, and I was really drawn to this, the fact that Jedediah tells the story of what happened to Susan. Kane built the Chicago Opera House for her, and she couldn't sing.
Well, she could. She just couldn't sing opera.
Right. And we see, as Roger Ebert puts it, great cinematic shorthand tell us how disastrous the opening night of the opera is. And then Mr. Thompson goes to see Susan, and we see the other side of the story. We see her side of the story. So we get a little bit from Jedediah, but then we get the other side of the story. So it makes this interesting, complete picture of what happened with their relationship.
From 2 different angles.
It's fascinating the way that happens. I was also interested, moving back a little bit, the movie opens, with all these reporters are talking about, he gets the assignment, find out about Rosebud. Rosebud, dead or alive. And we start with his childhood. I thought that scene was so fascinating with the parents because Orson Welles had a way of telling you everything and nothing, and figuring that you were smart enough to catch up. Did you notice? And this really caught me off guard the first time I saw it. We see the father and the mother. And we see it's that great shot where you see Charles outside playing in the snow. And then you see the father in the midground, and then you see the mother in the foreground, Mr. Thatcher. One thing I noticed, he seems to be in about his 60s.
Yeah.
The father. The mother seems to be in about her early 30s. So I'm thinking child bride.
I think he looked older and she looked a little younger than they both were at the time, but yeah.
I don't know if you caught that. But...
Yeah, no, it definitely. But if you look at a lot of old movies from back then, you'll have like a 10-year-old kid and the father will look like he's 65.
70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
well, I mean, it was the 19th century, so I mean.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was.
Women had to get married by 16. Didn't want to be an old maid and all that. But,
an interesting story about that shot, which I'm sure you discovered in your commentary watches. This particular shot is often the most cited when describing deep focus photography,
Right.
when in fact deep focus photography was not used in this shot.
Right.
It is a process shot. Wells became enamored with process shots, so he filmed the kid playing, and then rear projected it onto the window for the scene, so you can see everything, and it looks like it's deep focus, but it's actually a green screen, a blue screen projection shot, and there are hundreds of those in this movie. There are more special effects shots in this than there are in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think I remember reading.
Yeah. Well, and it's also a lot of this he brought from stagecraft.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of setting up the stage. Some of the transitions.
The transitions,
theatrical.
keeping the lighting on a person while they're starting to talk, and then having them be the last thing that's lit when it comes back to them, is very much a stage lighting technique that he worked into his dissolves in his editing here.
Okay. Help me with this, because I think I missed something.
Okay.
His mother,
Mhm.
Mary, apparently was given the deed to this worthless mining operation. Something, and whoever gave it to her died. And it turned out it was a gold mine,
Literally.
literally. Third largest gold mine in the world.
So what happened was she ran a boarding house.
Mm-hmm.
It's her name on the front, Mrs.
Mrs. Kane.
Kane's boarding house, and she was given this land deed in an attempt for a person to pay their back rent for the room.
Okay.
And initially it was thought to be worthless, and then all of a sudden gold was discovered, and it was then excavated and discovered to be the third largest gold mine, the Colorado lode, in the country, making them have the sixth largest private fortune. Although I don't know what a public fortune is, so I don't really know why that distinction is made. The sixth richest people in the world. But the deed was left only to Mrs. Kane, because that's whose name was on the business.
Were you surprised she didn't get screwed out of it? A woman in the 1860s, you would imagine that there would be all of these greedy old men who would be, walking in with a fistful of papers and trying to take it away. I was actually really surprised nobody tried to take it away from her.
You're right, and I think part of that probably was because she engaged the bank to oversee it, so that her rights would stay intact, because she wasn't turning anything over to them other than management of the estate, so they had every interest in her keeping it so that it would stay with their bank.
Yeah.
So their lawyers would probably have chased everybody away, because they want to keep this whole big...
keep that interest.
Yeah. Not only the interest, but I mean, they have Charles, they have, control over it, but without directly benefiting from it. But, they make a lot of money off of this deal.
One thing I love is it when Thatcher is describing everything that is laying out everything that's going to happen, and the father is complaining. He says people would think I wasn't a good father, that I'm going to send him away, and all of a sudden he tells him he's going to get $50,000 a year for the rest of his life, and he just changes his mind.
It is immediate. It is.
I guess it's all right. Money talks.
Yeah, hey,
I'm sorry.
and 50 grand a year in 1870,
Yeah,
or 1861, or whatever it was, that's That's more money than they would ever need
Right.
in just
Right.
1 year, let alone every year.
The funny thing is, so um, he's smarter than anybody ever really understands. He's extremely mischievous. He's extremely mischievous, but he's also very, very smart. And he spends, what is it, 25 years frustrating Mr. Thatcher.
Right, by the time he's 25, he's been kicked out of like 6 or 7 different colleges. He's been to boarding schools all
I
over
think
Europe.
it would be fun to run a newspaper. Oh.
It's like, I don't care about anything that's in here except for this newspaper.
Yeah.
Like, so you go ahead and manage all this other stuff. I don't really care. We'll keep you in control of it. I want to run the newspaper.
Which is exactly what happened
Mm-hmm.
to Hearst.
Mm-hmm.
This is exactly what happened to William Randolph Hearst.
There's... The funny thing is, this was originally going to be titled The American.
Right.
And
That's what Hearst always called himself, an American.
mm-hmm. And the Wells and his co-writer Herman Mankiewicz was the one with the Hearst obsession.
Mm-hmm.
They worked in Hearst, but they also worked in a lot of other rich figures to base Kane
Right.
off of. Andrew Carnegie, I think, was an inspiration for him, as well as Hearst, as well as, like, you know, the New York Rothschilds and all that kind of stuff. That he basically took this as an assault on old money.
Right.
Which is funny because he kind of came from old money himself. There are some autobiographical contexts within this as well.
It's not just Hearst.
It's not just Hearst. It's their Wells and Kane share a very similar upbringing. Wells's mother died when he was young. His father killed himself at when Wells was only 15 years old. Drank himself to death in a Chicago hotel room. He always kind of felt responsible for that because he told him that he didn't want any contact with him until he quit drinking. And he felt that spurred his father into this downward spiral to drink himself to death. He was then raised by like a father figure that was not really. He was Dr. Bernstein. They called him Dada Bernstein, which is where the Bernstein character got his name. He was a doctor who was interested in his mother after the divorce, but I don't know that they ever became paramours. But he loved Orson like his own son. But Bernstein was married, so. But I think the wife loved Orson too, so there was not really a big problem there. So they ended up kind of raising him as his own. He never really heard the word no. Yeah. Because everybody in his life thought he was a genius and told him so.
And everybody told him he was so perfect and he was so wonderful and he was this and he was this. And his head just ballooned up.
Oh yeah. And you know what? Not wrongfully either.
Right. He was a very bright kid, and he was a creative kid. He was, I mean, he grew into an adult that he grew up into effectively an insufferable adult, who was a genius and
knew it.
Pushed the players of the Mercury Theater to limits that they weren't really ready to go, but he almost killed some of them.
Yeah.
On stage one night, he stabbed somebody, pierced an artery, and it was during a play, and he almost died. The guy almost died
because the play went on.
Yeah.
It continued. he
And if you've ever seen the movie Orson Welles and Me, and Christian McKay plays him as such an SOB, that was him.
yeah,
That was him.
yeah. I've read a number of books on him, and basically he was like the wind. He could be the single most charming, affectatious person on the planet and turn on a dime into the most insufferable tyrant you could ever imagine.
Kind of like Charles Foster Kane.
Yes, there are a lot of parallels. And oddly enough, he obviously didn't know it, but a lot of this film predicts much of his career.
Right. Because if you know the fact of how he turned out, the fact of what he became later in life, if you know how insufferable he was, if you know how self-destructive he was, shouldn't surprise you at all.
No.
Because by the time he got to the end of the time you get to the last decades of his life, when he's doing the Parmesan commercials and he's on the Tonight Show and he's
trying to get end money for The Other Side of the Wind, and
and he's doing the
70
hot dog
other
eating
paragraphs,
contests and all that stuff, the fat jokes. By the time you get to all of that, you're not surprised.
Right.
The man was a genius, but by the time he got to the end of his life, he was basically a joke.
Because he was a joke because he did not care about his public image.
Right.
All he wanted to do was have money on his own terms, no strings attached, to make whatever movie he felt like making at the time. And another movie that I want to try to squeeze in before we hit our theme months is The Other Side of the Wind, his final film. Because the story to that and the story of the making of Citizen Kane are as fascinating as the movies themselves.
Yeah, the DVD that we have, the one that you and I watched for this, it's a 2-disc set that comes with the movie and also the American Experience documentary, The Battle Over Citizen Kane.
Oscar
nominated, which lays out his battle with William Randolph Hearst. And if you really look at these two people, they were born 30 years apart, but they could have been separated at birth.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the egos.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Could be nuclear. I mean, they were basically the same brain working in different arenas.
Right.
And I mean, they were the kinds of people that just steamroll over everybody else. And just, if they want something, they're going to go and get it. And it's that type A, that massive type A toxic personality that, and it's also very self-destructive.
Right.
And that essentially is what Kane is. Kane is an illustration of that. Kane is a meeting, to me, of both Hearst and Welles. It's an amalgamation. It's the two mixed together.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Welles took a lot of himself and put it into Kane. It's kind of, there's so much in this movie. I think that this is going to be one of those that we're going to have to come back to another time to get as much as we can in on this one, like 2001. This will bear a repeat conversation, but when you start looking at the character of Kane and he's bigger than life. He's egomaniacal. He's
Yeah,
he expects love without giving any.
Right, love on my own
love
terms.
on my own terms.
The tragic thing is, and I think Hearst was guilty of this as well. One of the tragic things is the idealistic man that you see at the age of 25.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about Kane. I think it would be fun to run a newspaper. He's telling Mr. Thatcher, I'm just having fun.
Right.
I'm doing this for fun. But then he turns on him and he tells him, I'm also doing this because I'm trying to do away with these money-mad pirates.
People like you.
People like
Thatcher. I think that it's really interesting, the progression of him in such a short period, where you go from the Declaration of Intentions,
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say that,
all the way through that marvelous breakfast sequence that ages them over years, and his wife says to him, what will the people think? And he'll say, they'll think what I tell them to think. So it goes from, I'm not going to interfere, I'm going to tell the true story, all the way to whatever I tell them is what they'll think.
That was a very Hearst line.
Yeah.
I can use the news and I can manipulate the news to create a situation that I need for whatever purpose.
Right.
And by the way,
you supply the pictures, I'll supply the war.
Right. Did you ever notice, and this was a subtle thing that I didn't notice until the other night, did you notice that breakfast table scene where they're first married and they're loving and they're talking to each other, and as it goes on and the years progress, it deteriorates
to not talking, and they're sitting next to each other, and then they start to sit on opposite ends of an ever-growing table. She starts reading the Chronicle.
Yeah, she's reading the Chronicle. That's what I was going to say. I don't know if you noticed that. But,
I did.
Yeah.
And she positions it so that he can see it, but he never looks up from the Inquirer.
Yeah.
And
Ruth Warrick is so great in that
scene. She's great throughout the whole film, and
he starts attacking her uncle,
who is the president.
Uncle John.
Yeah.
And it's again great cinematic shorthand. You just see over the years this deterioration. They don't have to tell you.
No, it's all done very visually and in a beautiful.
I waited all night while you went to the office for 10 minutes.
Right. Like Wells took all the right lessons from Griffith. He was a big fan of D.W. Griffith, specifically Intolerance. Wells was very anti-bigotry, unless it was fascists. He really hated fascists. But
he hired black actors.
Yeah.
The Mercury Theater.
Well, he did that. He did the whole the Harlem production of the all-black Macbeth, called the Voodoo Macbeth.
If you've ever seen footage of that,
yes, I have.
Remarkable.
Yeah, it is.
Really remarkable.
There's some footage of it on the Olive Films release of Macbeth, Wells's Macbeth. Go ahead.
He's in this film. I'm having to remind myself, by the way, occasionally, that he's only 25.
That is the trippiest thing about this. That he was only 25 when this came out. He was born in 1915.
It's kind of very. I don't mean to interrupt you, but it's kind of strange. There's a scene early on when he's arguing with Thatcher about the newspaper. And then all of a sudden, it cuts to 1929 when he's signing over the controlling interest.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, he's 30 years older. It's a little strange. It's. I don't know of another movie that has the confidence to do that.
Right, and it is the next, like it's a cut, and then you, just like the cut where he's a little boy getting a sled for Christmas, and Thatcher says Merry Christmas, and it cuts, and he says and a Happy New Year, and it's 20 years later, 15 years later. The only movie that's really done that, and it's very recent, was Boyhood, Richard Linklater's.
Yeah.
Where the kid would go up the stairs and he was 13, and he'd come back down and he was 18. You know, it's like what happened to the little sister on Family Matters. She went upstairs and never came down.
Right.
Like,
or the older brother on Happy Days who went out to play basketball, never came back.
Right, never came back.
But I've every time I watch this, I've got to tell you, every time I watch this, I always notice something I didn't notice before. Like this time, I noticed that the wife was reading the Chronicle,
mm-hmm.
and it's just whenever you see things, the movie is so complex, but you never lose your place.
You never do, and speaking of things that you probably don't notice, and I might say this, and you might go, "Oh my gosh, that's true." This is one of the few films where you actually see the ceiling.
Yeah, I knew that.
He did that on purpose.
Yeah, he did that on purpose. Before this, your sets were 3 walls,
mm-hmm.
and the top of the set was lined with these tracks for lighting,
mm-hmm.
and microphones and the boom mics, and so it would be like a diorama,
mm-hmm.
effectively. And this is the first film, and there's a lot of upward angles in this, and you see the ceiling in this, and you didn't see the ceiling before this.
Right. His impetus for that is kind of funny. Just, well, you don't see the ceiling in movies, so I'm going to show the ceiling. That was his whole modus operandi, and then he started noticing when he was doing these really low angle shots how towering he could make Kane and Leland, specifically, mostly Kane, that at certain points, and Wells replicated this over his career, especially in Othello, where in certain shots you would see it looking up at him as though he were this towering, magnificent figure. But there are other times where it'll be a more even or a downward-looking angle that would make him look so small.
Yeah.
And like the shot in front of that enormous fireplace when Susan Alexander, amazingly played by Dorothy Cummingore, is sitting in
2 or 3 times.
Yeah, and so this massive fireplace, and you see him sitting in a chair across the room, tiny. But when he goes over to the fireplace, he's still tiny. Like, you see how massive this fireplace is, and how big his concept of himself has become, which is Xanadu, and how small he's actually becoming because his influence is progressively, steadily, and rapidly fading.
Yeah.
So he's becoming smaller as his notion of himself becomes bigger.
One of my favorites takes place earlier. and that's the scene where Mr. Thompson goes to the Thatcher Library, and he's taken into this room where
I
there's a table.
love this.
I love it. He's taken into this room. It's very weird. It's like he meets with this curator, who it almost seems unnatural when she walks. She sways like a pendulum.
Mm-hmm.
It's very geometrical.
Mm-hmm.
This whole scene is very geometrical. And she walks, and she kind of moves like a clock.
Yeah.
And she gets to the door, and she pulls this door open with all of these weird bolts on it. It's very strange. And she opens it, and you see this table with this shaft of light. And this is the part I love. We see at the table the security guard, and in the back of the room we see the vault. And as the security guard walks toward the vault, he keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you realize just exactly how big that vault is.
I've always thought it was really funny that this guy who was basically a banker.
Yeah.
He's not even really the bank president, I don't think. He's a banker. And he has this library, he has this unpublished memoir, and, you know, you've been afforded a very rare privilege. Really? Because who would really care to read any of that? All he did was make money, like Bernstein says. So what? It's easy to make a lot of money if that's all you want to do.
But Thatcher had access to Kane
In his formative years.
So he would, if you're looking for real information about who Kane was, he would have been the first person you would go to.
Right. I think kind of erroneously, because he was not a father.
Right.
All he was doing was looking after he looked at
But he was the closest you had.
Right. But when you're going through his memoirs, you realize that Charles is nothing more than an investment to him.
Right.
He's just a living, breathing representation of a gold mine.
But this whole movie is about dead ends.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to get to the heart of who this man was. The problem is that each time we peel each of the 7 layers back, we get a little bit more and a little bit more. We learn everything and nothing. In a lot of ways, we really don't learn anything more about Kane in this film than the news on the March reel told us. Once we get to, we understand it personally.
You get the nuances and the explanations for a lot of the things that you saw in that, but it doesn't in the newsreel. But it doesn't explain. They purposefully omit motivation on his part, because in a lot of ways they want Wells and Mankiewicz, it feels like, wanted this character to be well-known and unknown, like a celebrity figure. So you would get why he did things on a personal level to a point, but there would still always be this kind of mystery as to what his motivation for some of these things were.
He's never completely on screen.
Right.
He's always... You're never in his shoes. You're never by his side. That shot, there's a beautiful shot in the middle of the film when he's talking to Jedediah. And you see how deep the office of the Inquirer... You see how big the office of the Inquirer is. And you can clearly see the back wall.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that they're standing mid-ground, and you're standing a distance away. So you can see the floor and the ceiling at the same time. That, to me, represents how far we are in the movie from Kane. We're always we're on the other side of the room, almost at all times.
Right. And if we're not across the room, we are looking up at him.
Right. And it's interesting to me that you notice Thompson gets frustrated every time he meets with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Because when he reads Thatcher's diary, when he reads Thatcher's memoirs, when it's over, he slams it shut.
Mm-hmm.
He
Because he didn't get what he was looking for.
He didn't get what he was looking for, and I think that's why I think Thompson is a terrible researcher, because what you do is you gather the information. I know he's looking for the meaning of that word, but you gather information so that even if you don't specifically find that piece of information, you can put it together.
He also didn't have a lot of time to be doing this.
Right.
So he's trying to get all this together in what, 2 weeks?
He's going all over the place, too.
Yeah, he's going all over the country, and he's trying to get this together in like a week.
Yeah.
Like, trying to piece together the entire life of a public figure in a week. The public figure, trying to not only understand him as a person, but why he said Rosebud as his last utterance.
He's trying to get to Rosebud, dead or alive.
Mm-hmm. And basically what that means is he has time to look through things or to talk to people about specifically that.
Mm-hmm.
What he gets in return is everything but.
Right.
So
he could write a book by the time he gets finished with
right.
this.
So, like, he asked Bernstein, who is this Rosebud? Is it a woman? Is it, what? And
I love the scene with Bernstein.
The story he gets is not related to Kane at all, the first story. Yeah. But it's a personal story from Bernstein talking about how he saw this girl getting off of a ferry in
1898.
Yeah, 1898, and it's 1941 at this point. And he said, I only saw her for a second, but I bet that there hasn't been a month that's gone by that I haven't thought of her.
Mm.
And that's a whole lot of what this movie is, the summing up of instance.
We all have moments like that.
Mm-hmm.
We all have, when you and I have shuffled off this mortal coil someday, later, hopefully later than sooner, there will be things that we will take with us that may have been left behind through evidence that no one would personally ever understand.
Mm-hmm.
It's that thing of your memories, of how memory is really tricky. It's interesting how your memory will pick up certain things,
mm-hmm.
but it doesn't pick up certain other things.
Right, like the old saying that our truth is defined by our perspective.
Right. History is written by, it depends on who writes it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, and so the history of Kane can never truly be written as the mission of Mr. Thompson is defined as the mission, because no one will ever know what Rosebud is.
No,
no one.
Thompson's been given a fool's errand. Like there's
right.
no way.
Whistling in the dark.
Right, he's screaming into the void. He's never going to find the information that he wants. He's a reporter. Basically, he just wants to go, what does Rosebud mean? And somebody says, Rosebud means this. And he can go back and say, Rosebud means this, and then he moves on to the next thing. And he never, ever gets that.
Maybe it's something he lost.
You're right. And in a way, it is.
He, And it's interesting that in a lot of ways, from Mr. Bernstein, a lot of what we get through those memories, through the flashback structure that Bernstein goes through, we get a lot of the upswing of his career. And in Jedediah, we get the downswing, a lot of the downswing of his career, of what happened. And largely, and again, it's all perspective. The reason for Jedediah is because Jedediah was the only person who was being real with him.
Right. I've always kind of looked at Jedediah's
Played wonderfully by Joseph Cotten.
oh, I mean, when did Joseph Cotten play a bad role? But
Heaven's Gate.
the movie was bad. He wasn't. He I've always kind of felt like his is the truest version that we could get because he knew Kane best and did not handle him with kid gloves.
Right.
He was the
You
only...
can't even say that about Bernstein.
No. Bernstein's
was an outsider.
Bernstein's part was all adoration because he still, even to that day, held great respect for Kane. Like he didn't acknowledge that that Kane had done some things wrong.
He remembers the good side of it. He remembers the positive Kane.
But
Jedediah didn't handle him with, like you say, didn't handle him with kid gloves, and remembers the darker times.
But he also does recount some good times too. Like
Right.
he's the only one that it ends up being, oddly enough, less subjective, even though he's the one outside of Susan who would have had the most grudge to bear.
Right.
Who was still alive being interviewed.
Right. And is probably the only, I'm just going to say this, probably the only person whose age makeup didn't work.
It depends on which angle, but yeah.
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 It didn't look
There's
right.
a reason for that, and I can't remember it. There's a book called Citizen Kane, a Filmmaker's Journey, by, I'll look it up here. But there
There are
was
100 books on Citizen Kane.
this one was actually like really in depth and goes from beginning to end. There is something to do with either Joseph Cotton's availability or something that they had to redo his makeup because he was allergic to something or they had to call him back to redo things and they didn't get the matching makeup, so that was like a big part of why that looks bad. Like that was it was all circumstantial. Citizen Kane, A Filmmaker's Journey by Harlan Lebo.
Okay.
Harlan Lebo.
Well,
it's a good
when
book.
You get down to it, again, it's the idea that he was the one. I think it really, after all of these things, when Susan has her really disastrous debut at the Opera House, he's writing a review that is very honest, and Kane fires him for it. And
After finishing it himself.
Because he knew it was bad. He knew it was bad.
Kane was one of those kinds of people that he could take a position that he didn't necessarily believe, just for argument's sake.
Right.
So he caught what Jedediah was writing, the only honest thing about that night that would have been in a Kane paper. And he was too drunk to finish it. He kept drinking and drinking, hoping that he would get enough courage to actually finish the thing. And he passed out at the typewriter. Right. And so Kane finishes it, and he doesn't rewrite it. He continues it on in that same vein, which is something that you would expect from him, but also not expect from him at the same time.
But in his old age, as he's sitting there in that nursing home, he doesn't seem to have a lot of bitterness about it, because he knew who Kane was, but he never seemed to have a lot of bitterness. He sits there and he's talking about it with a lot of affection.
Mm-hmm. He loved him,
and he was effectively his best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And Kane's soul was corrupted by the power that he wielded,
mm-hmm.
and his ability to move and rattle the pillars of the earth at will
mm-hmm.
got to him and corrupted his soul. That's what happened to Kane. And Jedediah was the only person that was able to recognize that, or was willing to acknowledge that.
To Kane.
To Kane.
You know, he was the only one that would actually say to his face, look, what you're doing is messed up.
Right. And it's so far, it is the greed that poisons a man's soul. Because you see that idealistic man who's yelling at Thatcher about, I want to see the decent hardworking folks aren't run mad by money-mad pirates. That man, by the time he gets to running for governor, is gone.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've got a little bit of power. I've got power in my own world, in the Inquirer. I want power now in the city.
Right. He's greedy, but not for money.
Right. He wants to be bigger and bigger and bigger.
Adoration and power.
Right. And the funny thing is, once you get to that concept, it all comes back down to what Jedediah says. He just wanted love.
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to be loved. And he thought, and it was a misguided opportunity, that he thought that he had it with Susan. He did, right at the beginning, when they're talking, and they're enjoying each other's company. And he married for the prestige, because he married the president's niece.
Mm-hmm.
He was close to the presidency. He's close to that family, and it's a powerful family. And then he marries Susan, who's not any of that.
No, and he tries to make her into that, and that ends up being his folly. He was trying to express his love in the only way that he knew how, because that was how the approximation of love was conferred upon him as a child, was give him whatever he wanted. So give her what he thinks she wants. He doesn't even take the time to listen to her. He's pushing her in this direction because that's what he decided she wants.
Well, I've built an empire and I've become one of the most famous men in the world. I know what's best for you. I know how to make you famous. It's like, no, you really don't.
Right, and he falls into the trap of the abuser. Becomes Susan's abuser, because he forces her into doing things that she knows she can't do.
Right.
She knows she can't sing opera. She likes opera. She would love to sing opera, but she knows she can't. But there she is doing it because for her, she's trying to make him happy. He's
Right.
trying to make her happy, and in the process, they both become miserable.
And it's, of course, this is Marion Davies, Hearst's mistress. And effectively, he does what Hearst did with Marion Davies, basically shoving her down the public's throat.
Mm-hmm.
And
The difference is Marion Davies actually had a lot of talent.
right, Susan doesn't have a lot of talent.
No.
Susan is generally a good person,
Mm-hmm.
genuinely a good person. And the back half of this movie, here's the damn thing about it. Despite the fact that he becomes so terrible, and the fact that he just loses control, and the fact that he becomes so greedy and his soul is so poisoned, I still feel a great deal of affection for him.
Mm-hmm.
And a great deal of sympathy for him, even when his empire is crumbling. I realize that he has brought it on himself, but I'm sitting there at the end of the thing, and I'm like, I don't want this to happen to you, because he and Susan are miserable.
Right, right. And he just dissolves into a tantrum wielding old man.
Yeah.
Both of them are fundamentally good people.
Yeah.
And both lost their way as a result of each other. He went around the bend and pushed her away by trying to make her happy, or at least his idea of what would make her happy. She, because she always felt inadequate, ended up becoming obviously a very heavy drinker, an alcoholic, trying to get past her own perceived inadequacies. Like she didn't feel like she was she should have been married to him because she's a nobody and he's everybody. He's the somebody, you know. Like I want to talk about the performances, specifically Wells, Cumming, Gore, and Cotton. But everybody in this movie is top notch.
Everybody. You remember even the minor characters.
Right. Like Agnes Moorehead playing the mother.
And the father.
Yeah.
Who, it's interesting, they'll drop little nuggets here and there that tell you little character details, but you don't need to illustrate them. The father almost hits the son, almost hits little Charlie. And it's an indication that perhaps he was abused by the father.
And that's why she's like, so your solution is whipping? He goes, yeah. And she's like, well, that's why he's going somewhere where you can never lay a finger on him.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
Does the father love him? Or...
Yeah. Well, I mean, he did love that $50,000 a year.
Yeah. Hey, I wouldn't turn that down either, personally. Yeah. But, I mean, if it meant selling my kid, I think I would have a problem with it. But
right. I think in the 19th century, that was actually a thing. You know, you would send your child off to be, where they could have a better life.
Oh, yeah.
That was a thing back then. But I like it. Say the performances in this are remarkable because, again, the 7 layers. As you get into these the 7 layers, you do develop a sympathy for these people because the performances are so finite. Because you learn so much about these people, but not a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
You learn enough that you care about them, and you can never say any of them are stock characters. It's like you see Jedediah, who loves him, who's like a brother,
mm-hmm.
and then you see Mr. Bernstein, who's really like an uncle. More or less.
An uncle / little brother. It's weird.
Right.
Right. It's so effective even when you find out that Marion Jr. died in a car wreck
Right.
when the kid was still little. Uh, you're saddened by that.
Yeah.
You see the kid in like 2 shots.
Is Pop governor yet?
Yeah. And it's all right there in that ending that last time the confrontation scene. That's really the only time you see the kid.
Oh God, the scene with Boss Jim Getty.
Oh,
That is a hard scene to watch.
yeah, it is.
Oh, it's just you're watching this fairly decent man just completely destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the political game of the early 20th century.
And I've always considered I don't know if this is part of the narrative or not. Um, I have always taken it as he and Susan were having a chaste friendship.
Yeah.
But they could not.
Yeah, I think that's.
But the only reason he married her was because their friendship was exposed to the media, and probably
They called it the love nest.
to make it so that she would not be eviscerated. He married her to make her an honest woman, as it were. Even though I never got the suspicion that he was playing around on Mary. He needed a real person who didn't know who he was to talk to. And that's who she was. She was the perfect person for him because she didn't know him, and once she found out who he was, she didn't care.
And she didn't bow to that prestige.
Right. She didn't treat him any differently after finding out he was Charles Foster Kane. He was always just kind of Charlie to her.
Yeah.
And her innocence, I think she's the most tragic figure in this, because her innocence, you watch that get destroyed.
Yeah.
And you watch what this life that should have been perfect do to her.
Mm-hmm.
And
at the end, and he drops the ball because he says the wrong thing. You can't do this to me.
mm-hmm.
And that's what sends her out the door. And she ends up going to Atlantic City, I guess, to be a singer,
Mm-hmm.
To do the thing that she knows how to do. And, well, let's talk about the last layer of this film, which is when we finally get to the bottom, and Mr. Thompson, in this really interesting Raiders of the Lost Ark shot,
Yeah.
where he's standing in this vast castle with all of these crates of stuff, collecting statues, as they say.
That's exactly what he was doing, too.
Right. And you see, it's a brilliant overhead shot because you can see a lot of the things that we have seen in the movie for the last 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And the strange thing is, he is literally 30 feet away from Rosebud.
Right.
But
And he never sees it.
he never sees it. But it wouldn't matter if he did.
No, because he would just look at it and be like, it's a sled? Like, everybody's reaction to it is like, oh, Rosebud is a sled. Okay, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Nothing
And
to
everything.
us. Nothing to us.
And everything to him.
It may have come from, it may have been something that the last gift that his mother gave him. There's a wonderful scene, and it's the only real insight that you ever get from Kane himself, is the first time he meets Susan. He says, I was on my way out west. My mother died some time ago, and the things are put in storage because there's no other place to put them.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on a sentimental journey. It never says it, but I think he was going to find Rosebud. He was going to find that sled. And the weird thing is, he found it.
Yeah.
Because he brought it back to Xanadu. but it ended up an artifact in a bunch of other stuff. It just...
Right. He had become so lost that even though he found the literal object he was looking for, he didn't find the resolution that I think he hoped it would.
Didn't make him happy.
Right. Because
And-
at this point, he's chronically unhappy.
Yeah, this is what I remember Ted Turner talking about this movie. He said, I'm going to be nice to my friends. I'm going to be good to my friends because I'm not going to end up like Charlie Kane. Just lost and destitute. Or not destitute, but destitute in his soul.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just lost in the vast caverns. The saddest line in this movie, the saddest line, is when Susan is sitting there and she says, 18,000 acres of scenery, I'm lonesome. She says, can't we go to New York? And he says, our home is here.
Right.
And I'm thinking to myself, and I'm looking around at this empty mansion
Mm-hmm.
full of stuff with no friends, no connections, nothing. This is home?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is home? You have all the money in the world. You can go anywhere in the world, but you're stuck here.
Right. Because of reclusiveness, because of whatever, just an unwillingness to deal with the rest of the world at that point.
Right. A pariah, just for the rest, a self-made pariah.
Right.
For the rest of the world.
And, I think it's fascinating. I'm going to bring this up here because it's an interesting juxtaposition. This was not his first project. I don't know if you knew that. He was trying to get his original first film was going to be Heart of Darkness.
Yeah, I heard that.
And he was trying to come up with a way to shoot it in the first person.
Yeah.
Like he was going to play the main part, but it was all going to be subjective through the camera, would be like looking through his eyes.
Yeah, I remember Norman Lloyd talking about that. He was like, it was a very strange concept.
You're right, that was not done fully until The Lady in the Lake, Alan Land's directorial debut, in which he did that. He played Philip Marlowe.
Right.
And I was going to say Raymond Chandler. I'm like, no, he wrote it. And then it was done again more recently with, what was that, Hardcore Harry?
Hardcore Henry.
Henry. It was a first person. It was basically a first person shooter movie.
Right. It was an interesting idea.
You're right, and he was trying to make it so that it would not be intrusive.
Yeah.
Which is what The Lady in the Lake ended up.
It's been that way before. They did that on an episode of MASH, where you were the perspective of the patient.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's disorienting when they do that.
It is. It's really disorienting. You have to be very, very clever to be able to do that.
And it really hasn't been done properly.
But coming down to the end of this movie, again, it's a box marked with question marks, full of question marks. It is the great mystery of human identity.
Right, and
how can we really ever know somebody?
Right, yeah. This movie does not provide you with answers.
No. This is the most discussion-worthy movie I think I've ever seen.
Because it offers no answers, and in a way, it's not really looking for them. Right. On the very, very tippy top of the surface,
you do
it's
feel
looking
bad
for
for
answers.
Thompson that he never really finds it.
I
love the idea.
Do?
I love at the end. I love at the end when he's got the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle in his hands,
Mhm.
just lets them flutter down into the box.
Right.
It's like,
Like, what is he gonna turn in? Like,
right.
he just spent this week or whatever finding out about this person. He has a lot of material that would produce exactly nothing.
If he's a good writer, if he's a really good writer, he could pull something out of that.
Hmm.
You know,
I don't know if he was is he writing an article, or are they going to make a follow-up newsreel? I thought he was working for the newsreel people.
I thought they were going to make a newsreel about it.
Right. So he has all this stuff, but none of it answers any questions, and therefore, from a reporter standpoint, everything that he learns is useless.
Yeah. And it is. I suppose he could write a book based on what he's learned
True, you know.
and just have it end with a question mark. But I can't really.
The way that they're tearing through everything and breaking down Xanadu, I think the book would be published about 2 years after people were actually interested in anything Charlie Kane.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like Hearst, who was just stayed a recluse and talked on speakerphones, and he didn't have that
Named Howard Hughes.
or yeah, the Howard Hughes reclusiveness. He didn't have that ability to continue to generate interest in himself,
Mm-hmm.
which is why he was fading away at Xanadu.
Yeah.
So if Thompson did write a book, and it did get published, nobody would read it in his lifetime. It would probably be one of those things where people would discover it years later.
Well, I will say this. This will be my final note on it. I think the biggest problem with Charles Foster Kane is that he never developed a sense of humility.
Right.
Ultimately, what we have with this man is someone who thought that he could rule and lord over everyone with his force of will.
Mm-hmm.
But if he had simply, at the end of his life, gone to Jedediah and said, I was wrong, it was my fault,
Mm-hmm.
or if he'd gone to Susan and said, it was my fault, instead of saying, you can't do this to me,
Mm-hmm.
if he'd have simply said to them, I think he would have had someone next to him by his side when he died, rather than die alone in this castle. You know, he never developed.
With no one but Paul Stewart and the
No one but
nurse.
Paul Stewart and his nurse.
Yeah.
And it's an extremely sad story, and it's a nice cautionary tale too.
Yeah.
But that's all I got.
Yeah. Let's dolly back from the miniature of Xanadu, because that is a miniature, folks.
Yeah.
By the way, they did not really build
No trespassing.
that monstrosity. All of that was miniatures, and you wouldn't know it.
Mm-mm.
I mean, again, the craftsmanship in this picture is, and it is the most complete movie, the most complete Wells movie we have.
Yes. And to my mind, the best. I know he had problems with it, but to my mind, this is the best.
We talked about this last month, 2 months ago, when we did Chimes at Midnight. I think Chimes at Midnight is the only one that could rival.
It could, but I mean, of course, you have to remember I'm off of a high from seeing this. For this episode, I watched the movie several times. I watched both commentaries by Roger Ebert and Peter Bogdanovich. I watched all the materials. I even watched some of the bullshit analytical stuff on YouTube from amateurs. I mean, it's just...
And here I am. I've seen this movie. I don't know how many times, but the last time I saw it all the way through was before I wrote my first chapter.
Yeah,
like a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
But when I wrote it, I had watched it kind of end to end, back to back, 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
read
Well,
books.
I'm glad we talked about this. I'm really glad we talked about this for our 100th episode because this was a lot of fun to talk about.
Yeah, this movie, so many like obligatorily, we probably should have started off the episode with what can you say about Citizen Kane that hasn't already been said, but that's already been said. So
We
even,
said
it. even that's a cliche.
Yeah.
But
Some of these movies I'm always afraid to go into because it's like, what am I going to say? It's like when we talk about Jaws, it's like, what am I going to say?
but this one is so layered and so dense that there's good reason that it has been talked about for nearly 80 years and will continue to still be able to be talked about, and new things will still be able to be uncovered 80 years from now. It is truly one of the greatest things ever. I think that wraps it up here for us on Citizen Kane, or at least this conversation on Citizen Kane. What do we have coming up?
Next week, we're going to start talking about Pride Month. Two straight dudes are going to talk about Pride
Two
Month.
cisgender straight dudes are going to talk
Right.
about gay men,
we're gonna,
bisexual men, trans women.
and we're going to start next week with one of the perennials of gay cinema, and it's called The Boys in the Band.
William Friedkin's
It is.
second film.
A very unusual film.
Yeah.
to say that.
Yeah.
A little dated, a little crude, but boy, is it
There's a lot going on there
fascinating.
too. Yeah. The one recommendation I have for Citizen Kane, listen to the score done
Yeah.
by Bernard Herrmann. It's his first theatrical score
Great.
after working in
Great.
radio for the Mercury Theater for several years. This is his first score, and it's wonderful. He also did Ambersons. This is before he started collaborating with Mr. Hitchcock. But then
And also, my recommendation, watch The Battle Over Citizen Kane.
that's a good one too. Then we move on from the Boys in the Band and travel.
Beginning our next 100 films. Boys in the Band is episode 101.
101. Then we're gonna dip into Alfonso Cuarón with Y tu Mama También. Then Ernst Lubitsch's extremely innovative and odd and clever picture, Designed for Living.
I love this film. This is my choice.
I had not seen it before. I've seen it now.
I did introduce it to you.
Yes. And then we're going to wrap up Pride Month with a discussion of Pedro Almodovar's All About My Mother. I like that we're kind of focusing on the lesser discussed nooks and crannies of the LGBTQIA plus.
I like the fact that we're moving around.
Yeah.
It's not like just all one thing.
Right.
It's different aspects of the rainbow, so to speak.
Mhm.
We're moving around and we're talking about different stuff.
Mhm.
So it's a collection of discussions, not just a discussion about one thing.
Right. So that's what we have.
101, episode 101 is Boys in the Band.
Boys in the Band.
That's next week.
102 is Y tu Mama También, and so we have a lot of fun stuff coming up. We want to encourage you to subscribe to the podcast here in iTunes or on YouTube. We have it posted in both. You can find all of the back episodes that we have on the Podbay podcast.wordpress.com. You can find us on Twitter at pod_bay. It's the best way to know when we have a new episode. And you can throw a tip into our virtual tip jar at Patreon at the same username at pod_bay. We thank you very much for tuning in, and the Pod Bay doors are now closed.
The mission has been completed.
Can't buy me love. Can't buy me love. I buy you a diamond ring, my say you love me too. I may not have a lot to give, what I got I'll give to you. But I don't care too much for money. Money can buy me love, buy me love. Everybody tell me so, can buy me love. No, 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 no. Say you don't need no diamond ring, and I'll be satisfied. Tell me that you want the kind of thing the money just can't buy. 'Cause I don't care too much for money. Money can buy me love. Wow! Can buy me love. Everybody tell me so. Can buy me love. No, 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 no. Say you don't need no diamond ring, and I'll be satisfied. Tell me that you want the kind of things the money just can't buy.